Hey, Major, this is great to see you again. Great to talk to you. It's been a long time since we've done this. Today we're going to be recording something exciting, very topical, and yet was exciting in the context of being able to talk about it. It's a source of much unhappiness for a lot of people for very appropriate reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we need to discuss this, and we need to talk about this as pharmacists. We need to talk about this as people who work in the life sciences industry, and it's important that we discuss what the implications are. And obviously what we're talking about right now is the opioid crisis, and talk about the impact it has on lives.
You're listening to the Gavel and Pestle Podcast with Darshan Kulkarni. The Gavel and Pestle Podcast, where the law of the land intersects with the business of pharmacy.
Hey, this is Darshan. Just before you listen to the podcast, make sure you remember this is not legal advice. This is also not medical advice, and it's not construction advice, so don't take construction advice from me. Also, this does not create an attorney-client relationship, so don't be saying that I just gave you legal advice again. Talk to a lawyer who knows you, that can give you advice that's right for you. Thanks again. Keep listening. We'll talk soon.
Major, have you had any experiences around the opioid crisis?
I think that's a topic that not very many people would be comfortable talking about. I'm sure that many have been or have been affected by situations where, dealing with the opioid crisis.
Absolutely, and I think that's the point we're trying to raise, right? It's like most people we know are being affected. I mean, one of the statistics I read was that the NIH says that 90 Americans die from an opioid overdose daily, and that half of those are prescription opioids. That's a lot of people.
I'm sure one of the more common situations, right, where someone is like injured or hurt in an accident, maybe something like Percocet is prescribed for pain. And prescription runs out, addiction's in full swing, and then suddenly they don't have access to Percocet or the prescription for anything else, any other opioid, so they have to fall back to something like heroin.
And that's exactly what happens. You start off with a legitimate condition, a condition you need to be treated for. And instead what you land up with is an addiction. And how do you fix it? It's funny, you say that. There was a recent study that came out that talked about using things like ibuprofen and Tylenol. And basically came out and said, you know what? These things work almost as well as the opioids. Do we really need to use them as much as we use opioids? Are there alternatives? So that might be something to consider. It's funny that as a pharmacist, you hear about the opioid crisis and you hear about people talking about it. But what's interesting to me, at least, is the fact that we talk about alternatives, and one of the things we talk about is a drug called tramadol, and we're like, you know what? It's one of those things that's not as bad as opioids. It's sort of like a better version of Tylenol. No, it's actually addictive in many cases, and it's considered to be a controlled substance. And there needs to be more education around it. It's funny. I read about this. Well, again, funny may not be the right term for this.
Interesting, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting, I guess, is one way to phrase it. But this woman was going to, I believe, Egypt, and her husband was in pain there, so she took a little bit of, well, not a little bit. She took a lot of tramadol for her husband. Turns out it's illegal in Egypt, and she went to jail over it. And she's like, it's not illegal where I'm from. I don't know why I'm being jailed. And they're like, well, it's illegal where you're coming, and that's why you're being jailed.
Right.
And that fundamental lack of understanding around opioids, whether it's patients, whether it's clinicians, is where there needs to be more education. And we talk a little bit about what governments are doing. We can talk about the fact that President Trump created a commission on combating drug addiction and created the Opioid Crisis Commission in March 2017. We can talk about the report that came out in November. We can talk about the fact that according to the commission, that is, 36% of these pharmacists consider extending prescribing of opioids to be a violation of law or an unacceptable medical practice. But the fact is, it's still happening. The fact is, people are being affected in very personal ways. So what I really want to talk about in this podcast is what are some steps we're taking? What are some things that are happening? And instead of talking about how big a problem this is, because at this point, I think talking about how big a problem this is sort of like talking about breast cancer and breast cancer awareness. Most people know about breast cancer awareness. Now, what most people are saying is, great, let's start solving the problem. And I think that's what we need to start focusing on. And I think that's what we want to do in the opioid crisis. We understand there's a problem. You don't need to tell us that. Tell us how we fix this. And I think this will be our first salvo in that mechanism.
But at the same time, I think it's still kind of important to go into it just a little bit, just because, you know, like a problem everyone has heard before or has experienced before, or even if they have personal connections to, when they don't fully take into consideration the problem as a whole, they start overlooking specific details that are actually really important to the solution. And I'm sorry?
I think that's fair. I agree with you. No, I'm agreeing with you totally.
Oh, for sure.
So maybe we do talk a little bit more about the background. Maybe we talk a little bit more about why this is a problem. And then maybe we start off by talking a little bit about just where does this whole thing come about? So we talk about opioids, and maybe we talk a little bit about, well, there's something called the Controlled Substances Act. We talk about the DEA and the role that it plays.
Right.
The Controlled Substances Act was passed in the 1970s, and the idea of the Controlled Substances Act was that essentially every time a drug that is considered to be controlled, i.e. it has addictive potential, it gets put into this, so we say a closed system. And the idea is that you know at any given time who has how much drug. That way, you aren't losing drugs to well, I guess at that point it was considered to be more to illegal options. But now it's also legal options. But the idea was, so for example, as pharmacists, we all know this, but to those of you who aren't pharmacist listeners, it's interesting to hear and to understand that your pharmacist can, at any given time, can tell you how many Percocets to the pill number is in his or her pharmacy at that moment. They can tell you how many Vicodins there are. They can tell you how many plain old oxycodones there are. So this is a system to control that. But what it does is it controls the problem of tracking. But what it doesn't do is controlling the problem of giving the medication out. And that's where the issue of pill mills come in. And the issue of the fact that sometimes certain physicians start seeing a bunch of patients who are who need access to these medications, and instead of evaluating them on a case-by-case basis and going, you need the drug, you do not need the drug, you need a treatment for your addiction, they start giving everyone access to these very addictive medications. And the DEA and the Department of Justice have both been cracking down on it. And that needs to be something that people need to understand, that it's not a problem now where only the users are being held responsible, sort of. And when I say held responsible, I mean, they're obviously, when you're addicted, what you start doing are things like robbing pharmacies, using violence to get access to these medications. And there have been situations where people have been shot, where doctors have been shot for not prescribing the medications, which understandably makes them scared.
Well, then you have those situations where, like the town in West Virginia, right, that was flooded with the pain pills, and then that's kind of an issue. That's a community issue, and that's also a pretty significant symptom of the opioid crisis, I would say.
Exactly right, and I think that's a very fair problem, and we're going to talk about that for sure, because that's a great issue to raise. The opioid crisis issue is not a single layer issue. It's not addicts causing all the problems. It's also doctors who are enabling these addicts. It's the pharmacists who are enabling the doctors. It's the drug manufacturers and drug distributors who are, well, let's talk about the drug distributors first, who are sending an inappropriately large amount of drugs, of opioids, to places that simply shouldn't have them, like the West Virginia case you were talking about a second ago, to the pharmaceutical companies who were going out and saying, you know what, let's market to doctors, let's tell them that zero pain control is the goal, to organizations like JACO, who in the goal of saying zero pain control is the goal for patients, enabled this crisis as well. And that's the goal. It's to understand that fixing one part of this system is not going to fix the crisis. So we can talk a little bit about, for example, what can pharmacists do? And we can talk about this concept of red flags and the duty of pharmacists to ensure that they act as responsible corporate citizens. And they act, and ignoring even the corporate citizen part of it, the core duty of a pharmacist is to be that neighborhood healthcare provider. You're the one who sees these patients routinely, possibly more than doctors. And you're dealing with them every single day. These are your neighbors. These are your friends. And to let them just get the medication they want is not you being a good neighbor. It's you enabling them. So as a pharmacist, as a neighbor, as a friend, it's your job to go out there and think about things like, has this patient received multiple controlled substances prescriptions from different doctors? This is a continuing problem because there used to not be a way of actually tracking that. Now there's something called the PDMP, which most states have now, a lot of states have. It's a prescription drug monitoring program. And what that does is it tracks all the opioids or certain controlled substances that the patient's taking. And the idea is that the pharmacist has a duty to check that to make sure that the patient's getting only drugs appropriately.
You know, Darshan, I kind of want to make a point that you're not just taking this perspective from someone from the outside. You are a pharmacist, so you have firsthand experience and knowledge in dealing with these situations, right? So like
absolutely,
the PDMP, this affects you as well.
It absolutely does, and it's a duty that each one of us needs to uphold. Not just me as a lawyer talking about, this is not a problem, this is something that's removed from me. As you pointed out, I'm a pharmacist. I dispense medication still. And as part of that problem, I have to be conscious. I remember when I was in pharmacy school, and one of the things we had to do was we rotated through an insurance company. And as part of this, so long ago, what I had to do was look at the opioids that patients were taking and evaluating. And I remember this whole conversation of look out for back pain because it's really hard to tell if the patient legitimately has back pain. And I think those are issues that we need to – there are prejudices, and we can talk about those as well. But there are issues, and we as pharmacists need to combat them. For example, like we were talking about these red flags, we were talking about multiple doctors sending out medications to the same patient, and there used to be no way of tracking it, or a patient receiving multiple controlled substances for the same symptoms, or the patient coming in receiving early refills, and this used to bother me. I remember distinctly, and I know most pharmacists have had this type of patient. They come in early for refills, and then sometimes they'll be like, oh, let me get you some chocolates. Let me get you some candy. Let me get you some
Wait, the pharmacist
soda.
would say this?
This is the patients. They would come in, and they would ask for the prescription, and it would be just an extra 2 days early. And it felt weird, and it felt wrong.
But the patient would offer chocolates and candy?
Yeah. And the idea was we're just friends. We're trying to be friends. And I think that's a good thing. And I think to a certain extent, the idea of being a good neighbor is good. But when you're dispensing controlled substances, you need to keep an unbiased perspective. And I remember us having that conversation. This was when I was still a student. And I remember talking to my pharmacist, and he was like, I'm aware of this, and I'm monitoring the situation because I don't want us to be in a bad position.
Before we get into that, let's have a word from our sponsors.
Keycentrix has been leading and guiding the pharmacy industry for over 40 years. A forerunner of innovation and technology, Keycentrix more than delivers pharmacy software solutions to the ever-expanding complex network of healthcare. The heart of Keycentrix is dedicated to restoring patient health and promoting patient compliance by the continuation of care through pharmacy management. Keycentrix brings pharmacy management to a comprehensive level of understanding and precision unlike anything available in the industry. Keycentrix New Leaf RX pharmacy management software revolutionizes this opportunity for specialty pharmacy markets. New Leaf RX thinks like a pharmacist and a prescriber at the same time, while also providing the data needed for decisions from every other contributor in the healthcare ecosystem. New Leaf RX will lead to successful outcome-based processes, guaranteed. At the end of the day, Keycentrix software packages have what every pharmacy has been looking for. New Leaf RX is the next level of pharmacy management systems. For more information and to experience a demo, visit keycentrix.com.
So it's like, thank you for the Hershey Kisses and M&Ms. I know what you're doing.
That's exactly what it is.
Well, there are these different solutions proposed, right? That are in place, like the PDMP, for example. But
right,
what is the pharmacist's responsibility in situations like that? I mean, how much is too much from the perspective of the pharmacist with all the bureaucratic red tape? Does it all just roll downhill and land in the lap of a pharmacist? What happens there?
And that's exactly the problem, right? So everyone says a little bit like, that's not my problem. The pharmacist goes, well, how do I know whether the patient needs it? I'm not a physician. That's the physician's job.
Yeah, maybe another way to phrase it is like, yes, we should do everything we can to protect public health. Absolutely. But how do we know we're leaning on the point of distribution like the pharmacists because potential issues further up the chain are creating it?
And I think that's part of the problem. So what we're not saying is it's all the pharmacist's fault. It can't be. The pharmacist doesn't have all the information. What we're saying is it's the pharmacist's duty to look further. You aren't going to catch every single mistake. No one's asking you to. What we're asking you to do is look closer, evaluate closer, and spend a little bit of time. You're not an ATM. Your job is not to simply go, you ask for medication, here's your medication. And far too many retail pharmacies fall into that, where they essentially become just an ATM for medications.
But then on the other side of the spectrum, you kind of have a pharmacist potentially being the judge and jury of prescriptions, right?
Right.
What about the scenarios where the pharmacist is refusing to advance patient care distribution, like medications or assistance, because of their perceived restrictions?
That's a great question. And actually, the next point I was going to get into, and actually very, very timely. So there are some states that were suggesting, you know what we want to do? We want to restrict the amount of opioids patients can get because we think that this will cure the crisis. And there are patients who are in chronic pain sometimes, and they are in legitimate chronic pain. And things like ibuprofen is not going to touch them. Things like Tylenol not going to touch them. Patients who are in sickle cell crisis, who are going, and I've actually dealt with these patients in the hospital. I've just to be clear, I've worked in hospitals, I've worked in retail pharmacies, I've worked in most pharmacy settings that you can think of outside maybe like radio pharmacy or nuclear pharmacy. So I can speak to these from those perspectives. But for example, sickle cell patients, you're typically in a hospital. If you give someone 2 milligrams of Dilaudid, they'd be snowed. They'd be pretty happy. It'd be fine. I've seen patients get 16, 20 milligrams of Dilaudid every 2 hours, and they're still in pain. Sickle cell can be really, really bad. And if you start saying we're going to cut off patients at a certain dose, what happens to these patients? Are we just going to say that you don't fit into this nice, round, clear spectrum that we've created and you just have to suffer?
Right.
That's not fair either. So I think governments are struggling. So when one of the states tried to say that we're going to limit it, the patients came back and they said, that's not okay. We are in pain. So to your point about pharmacists, you can't be judge and jury either, because there are patients who legitimately need this. And that's where that conversation comes about. You need to talk to the physician and go, I know you wrote this prescription, but are you aware that there are 3 other doctors who wrote these prescriptions? Are you aware that this patient got the prescription early last month? Are you aware that he hasn't seen you the last 2 times?
Yeah, and there's a reason that a pharmacist is a position that is not going to be automated anytime in the near future because of those types of situations where those considerations have to be considered.
So it's funny you say that. That's going to be...
Well, let's go back to the solutions that we had. The PDMP is one solution. There were other solutions, right? What about like a safe site for needles?
It's funny you mentioned that. Yeah. So you use the term safe site, Major, and that's great. One of the things that we should talk about is the concept of a safe site. Really, I tend to backpack and I tend to travel a lot, and I saw this. I think that this was in Norway, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and the idea was that patients who were opioid addicts are usually injecting themselves. People who are using heroin, using some of these other much harder drugs, were using them in the streets, and they would die because there was no one there to sort of help them. So these countries, what they came out and said is, you know what we're going to do? We're going to give patients a safe space that they can come to. We're not going to judge what medication or what drug you're taking. We just want to have doctors there who can pull you out or who can help or try to help if the situation arose. And the city of Philadelphia just said that they're going to do it, and they're launching that. San Francisco just came out and said they want to do the same thing as well. So we're definitely taking those steps. We're also looking at a situation where Rite Aid was fined $800,000, $800-something odd thousand dollars for alleged violations of the Controlled Substances Act.
Oh, wow.
And the DEA is looking at things like creating abuse deterrent opioids, so that they're not very eager to approve opioids anymore, because they're going, we need to make sure that it's not just an opioid, but that you're controlling the way the drug is administered. So you can't just smash a 320 milligram pill of oxycodone or a 160 milligram pill of oxycodone. You are getting that in a controlled way, and that if you smash open the pill, the drug itself gets neutralized. So there are some of those things, like we said. We've got the PDMP that's already in place. And then you've got situations like CVS and Walgreens, each of them trying to do their own piece. CVS basically came out with with this idea of working with their benefits management system and implementing new policies. Walgreens came out with the "It Ends With Us" campaign. And then there are issues around the idea of telehealth, and there's the Ryan Haidt Online Pharmacy Consumer Protection Act,
right,
which is going to require a controlled substance to be dispensed via a valid prescription.
By telehealth, you mean teleconferencing prescription?
I should clarify that. Thank you. So telehealth is this new range of services, and I've got clients already talking about it, already using it. And the idea is, does the pharmacist need to be on site to actually give you the medications? Is it better, for example, for the pharmacist to not be on site? So there are certain providers who will have some pharmacists on site, certain pharmacists not on site for dispensing, and it's a new strategy to enable pharmacists to actually start talking to patients. And that's going to be the future, I think. What is that going to look like? So we can talk about that. We can talk about a lot of these things, but we've sort of already gone well over time. Any burning questions before we stop and talk about something different, Major?
Well, no, I don't have any questions right now. I think we've addressed them all. One of the biggest concerns that I had was there was an article recently about a potential proposed solution regarding Medicare for the new proposal. I saw an article, I think 2 days ago or so, but when I read it, it said that it proposed that pharmacists would be able to deny opioid prescriptions. Well, I came back today to look at it to review for our discussion, and the edit said that it incorrectly said the pharmacist would be able to deny opioid prescriptions under the new proposal. In fact, insurers would be the party responsible for denying a prescription. So that's pretty, I mean, the end result would be similar in that the prescription would be denied for one reason or another, probably related to the PDP. But the issue was placing a solution direction in the lap of the pharmacists themselves. Just another thing for them to do. But that's why I was like, let's talk a bit more about the opioid crisis and kind of be more informed about that before we kind of go into those solutions. Because I was
Absolutely,
concerned.
but I want to add to this, though, Major. The key piece you need to remember is that pharmacists can deny opioid prescriptions. We are allowed to say this is not okay. I'm not going to dispense this product, which obviously puts a lot of burden on pharmacists because you're standing in front of a patient who's potentially in pain, who potentially could get violent, who potentially could say that I am unhappy and express that to you. And this is a person you very likely cross in the streets, and you have to stand there and say, no, I'm not going to give it to you.
Well, so can't they say that anyway? That is actually
your job.
With anything, it just kind of
Absolutely.
Comes down to a point of like, I want you to come back to be a customer of this pharmacy. However, this is a safety situation. Right. I want you to be a patient of this pharmacy.
Right. Absolutely.
But where does that business line kind of stop, right?
Right.
And the personal accountability ethics kind of comes into play.
Correct. Because pharmacists can be held, and we don't get into this too much on this podcast, but we probably should talk about it. Pharmacists are expected to be a type of learned intermediary. And the idea is that doctors are expected to know, and sort of, so how should we phrase this? In liability lawsuits, there's this idea that a doctor is the quote-unquote learned intermediary, and that means that it's the doctor's decision and it's the doctor's responsibility to decide whether a certain medication is right for the patient. Mm-hmm. However, it's the pharmacist has a quote-unquote corresponding responsibility. And since they have this corresponding responsibility, they are also responsible to look into and evaluate if this patient is responsible. So under the Controlled Substances Act, they actually define it. Corresponding responsibility means that the individual pharmacist has an obligation to ensure the controlled substance he or she is dispensing is for a legitimate medical reason and written by a medical professional in the usual course of professional practice. It does not mean that the pharmacist has to stand in the shoes of the medical professional prescribing the controlled substance, but rather pharmacists have an obligation to ensure that their to exercise their professional judgment in scrutinizing the prescriptions the pharmacist receives and dispenses. So that's sort of where the red flags we discussed earlier came from, and that's where the pharmacist has to adhere to this, because if they don't, they're in violation of the law. There are pharmacists who've gone to jail over this. There are pharmacists who've paid tremendous amounts of fines over this. So it's probably a good idea to look out for this, not just for your patient, but for your own license.
Oh, I bet. So, Darshan, do you have anything else to add?
I think we're good for now, but let's stay tuned for some more of our conversations coming up soon.
Oh, absolutely. If you have further questions about the opioid crisis and what we've discussed in this podcast, you can reach out to Darshan Kulkarni at the Kulkarni Law Firm on Twitter, at Kulkarni Law Firm. That's Kulkarni Law Firm. Or website, kulkarnilawfirm.com. Phone number is 215-948-8183. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, this is Darshan. Thanks for listening in. I really want to talk to you. Reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at FDA Lawyers. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Darshan Kulkarni. And if you want to find me any other way, well, start with Twitter, but you can always email me as well. Darshan at conformlaw.com. Thanks for listening in. I'm really excited to hear from you.